Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming here. And for those of you joining in online, whether you're tuning in from Austin or Arizona, welcome. And tonight, I'm very, very excited about the saint that we have tonight, St. Francis of Assisi. He played a big role in my own discernment and kind of my own big moments. He seems to come up, so I'm excited for this evening and for Brother Joel Giallanza. I think I got that somewhat right. Yeah.
You did.
All right. And so we're going to have some. He's going to have a presentation, and then we'll have some questions at the end. If you're tuning in online, if you're on our website, there's now a question box that you can submit a question online. If you're on Facebook, I'll be looking on Facebook. So if you see me up here on my phone, please don't judge me. So I'll get your questions in my email, or I'll be checking Facebook. So, and then if you're here in our in the church here, when it comes time for questions, please stand up and I'll repeat the question so our friends online can hear. So. With that, I turn it over to Brother Joel.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and all of those online, thank you for joining us. As Isaac mentioned this evening, we're looking at St. Francis of Assisi. I want to begin with just part of the psalm that's used as the responsorial psalm for his feast. Keep me safe, God, for in you I have found refuge. I have said to the Lord, you are my Lord. From you alone comes all the good that I enjoy. I have set the Lord before me at all times. With the Lord so near, I cannot be shaken. I think when we look a bit at Francis' life, that psalm will make eminent sense that the church chose it for his feast. I admit that not all people, this series, as you know, is Mondays with the Mystics. Not all people would place Francis of Assisi among the hardcore mystics. And to a degree, that's true. However, he has this enduring popularity. A lot of images surround Francis of Assisi. And his teaching has endured for many centuries. And in fact, as we'll see, his teaching has an impact even on contemporary aspects of spirituality. So maybe because of all of that, my last name's Giallanza, so I thought I would begin with an Italian. Francis was born in Assisi, Italy, in 1181 or 1182. That seems strange for us to say that way today. But we have to understand, records by the church were not always kept clearly. Many times they were handwritten. Most of the time they were handwritten at this period. And so it wasn't always clear. So the exact year of his birth is not known. He is the son of Pietro di Bernardone, who's a very wealthy cloth merchant. Cloth was an extremely valuable commodity in the Middle Ages. You could make great wealth from selling cloth, exporting cloth, dealing with cloth in any way, because everyone bought it, not just for clothing, but for decoration. The royalty wanted. So he comes from a very wealthy family. There's not many specifics we know about Francis' early life, but it seems that his mother, Pica was her name, was from France, most certainly from a wealthy family and possibly even a noble family. His father was away on a business trip, clearly dealing with other cloth merchants. His father was away on a business trip in France when Francis was born. And because infant mortality rate was relatively high, just because of lack of medical care, diseases. His mother had him baptized and gives him the name Giovanni, John. Well, again, it may be somewhat strange to us, but in the Middle Ages, it was the father's right to give a name. But she had him baptized and gave him his name. When his father returned, he insisted that the baby's name be changed to Francesco, and so it was. Either because of his wife's connection to France or because of his business dealings in France. Again, it's a different world to us. A baby could be named for personal reasons, for family reasons, and even business reasons. I don't know if most of us would say to our boss, "Oh, it's so wonderful, I named the baby after you." Well, but that was not uncommon. Whatever the connection, it's clear that his name is related to France, either because of his mother or because of his father's business. Francis had a very good education, which reflected the economic status he came from. Of course, he knew Italian. He was Italian. But he also learned to read and write Latin, and he knew a good bit of French. He enjoyed speaking in French and reading French literature, but he never really came to a point of real proficiency in that language. He was exuberant and energetic, and he was recognized as a leader among the young people of the town. He was the one that would organize things and get them involved. He was especially fond of the culture of the traveling troubadours, which were very common in the Middle Ages. They would recite poems and sing of courtly love and of high ideals that were to be lived. Those troubadours earned their living by traveling from town to town, and through their poetry, their music, anything that they did, their acting, they gave the people a bit of an escape from just the routine of daily life. All of that really fed the imagination and the ideals of Francis, and he enjoyed that. Francis' access to wealth and his carefree personality led him to a life of extravagance and wanting the good life. However, by his contemporaries' own testimony, that never led him to a life of immorality. I mention it because that was common among the wealthy in the Middle Ages, and it was a common, especially among wealthy youth. But his contemporaries say Francis never went in that direction. He was just the life of the party and rather enjoyed that. He would always be showing off his fine clothing, and he was a practical joker. He enjoyed the wealth he had, and he used it well, and he could do pretty much whatever he wanted, and most especially, he treated his friends well. He treated them to things. His dream was to be a chivalrous hero, a great knight. That was the dream in the Middle Ages. In addition to what the troubadours presented in their entertainment, reading about and thinking about knighthood, both for men and women, was popular for many centuries. Many centuries, that was the dream, because knights had access to the nobility. They were the heroes, military heroes, people who saved countries, or at least saved the people in the midst of war. So Francis joined the military, and he happily went to war. And I mean it just like that. He happily went to war. He was captured during a war between Perugia and Assisi. We have to understand at this time, Italy was not the country that we know. It was a series of small city-states, a variety, all of these different kingdoms. Assisi was a kingdom, Perugia was a kingdom. There were constant territorial wars. I want what's yours. What's yours is mine. And if I can't have it, I'll simply take it. Constant territorial disputes. Where is the dividing line between this small country and this small country? So in the war between Perugia and Assisi, Francis was captured and he was imprisoned for a year. It's not really until after the middle of the 1800s, which in the bigger scheme of things isn't that long ago. It's not until after the middle of the 1800s that Italy becomes the country we know, because all of these little kingdoms were unified under a single king, Victor Emmanuel II. So these little battles continued. When Francis was released from prison, he returned home, and he took up his former life of parties. He really didn't have to do anything. His father made more than enough money. He was seriously ill for a time. That could be from anything at this time. Malaria, cholera, yellow fever, all of these things were common, and one could get quite sick. After he recovered, he returned to the wars, in fact, because he was hoping to become and to be known as a great knight and a fearless warrior. However, his prison experience and his extended illness gave Francis a sense of something he had never had before: reflection. What do you do when you're sick in bed? What do you do when you're sitting in a prison? Well, he chose to reflect. He wasn't sure that he was completely pleased with the direction his life was taken. What's the value of my life? What's the meaning of my life? At least he would begin to think about those things. And he wondered if there would be a different kind, a new kind of knighthood that he could take up, that wouldn't involve all the complications of becoming a great knight as it was understood at the time. One day, after he was back home, he encountered a man who was a leper. And spontaneously, for no apparent reason, he hugged this man and kissed his hand. This was an extraordinary gesture, because Francis considered lepers absolutely repulsive, as did all of society, most certainly the wealthy. And yet he did this. He continued to reflect. Prayer was always a part of his life, but it began to become more focused and more intense. And you know the story. One day he is praying before a crucifix in a grotto near Assisi. I'm not sure it was a grotto as much as it was this part of the church, and all the rest had collapsed. But he's praying before the crucifix. And in that prayer, he heard Jesus say to him, "Go, rebuild my church, which you see has fallen into ruin." So as if all of this is destroyed, and I'm praying there. Francis took the words quite literally and began a campaign of rebuilding churches and chapels that had fallen into disrepair. Well, that makes sense, because a lot of times all of the men were at war, one way or the other, or away on business. So he literally begins by gathering stones and rebuilding the church and rebuilding these chapels. Well, this continued, and others began to assist him. Some of the other wealthy young men from the village just started donating stones, started helping him just rebuild these churches. Francis decided to devote himself to a life of poverty and simplicity. That, I think, was the fruit of his reflection. All of these things were simply getting in the way of his life, of the life he felt he really wanted to live. You can be sure he was thought of, and he actually appeared to be an absolute madman, given the wealth into which he was born. What are you doing? His friends, who weren't helping him with the stones, his friends spoke to him, his family spoke to him. There seemed to be nothing evident of his former life in the way he was living now, and it made absolutely no sense. Well, eventually his father had had enough, and publicly his father disinherited him and disowned him. In response, Francis returned everything he had ever received from his father, including the clothes he was wearing at that moment. And he proclaimed publicly he would be completely free to say, "Our Father who art in heaven," and not Father Pietro di Bernardone. It's a little shocking, so he disowned his father in return. Francis went then to live in a small chapel that he had rebuilt. And he continued his life of poverty and prayer, and he added to that now preaching about Jesus crucified, preaching about this one who was stripped of everything except God. He continued that life. Many were attracted by this, wealthy and the not wealthy. Many came to be part of this and to share in his way of life. And in 1209, they called themselves, well, we call them the Franciscans. They called themselves the Order of the Friars Minor, the little brothers of Jesus. Their work and their preaching was always to reflect the poor Christ, the Christ who had nothing except what God chose to give. We know at some point Francis was ordained a deacon, but it seems he never aspired to the priesthood. So as far as we know, he was a deacon. But when that happened, again, it's one of those things, records were not well kept. Just 3 years later, in 1212, a wealthy young noblewoman came, Chiara Offreduccio. She wanted to join Francis. She wanted to live what he was living. And she founded a convent of women, other women from a variety of classes of society who wanted also to live this way of life. They call themselves the Order of Poor Ladies. We know them today as the Poor Clares. This Chiara we know as St. Clare of Assisi, in fact. Just real quickly, she was born of a noble family, a wealthy family, in 1194, and she died in 1253 at 59 years old. She was canonized 2 years later, in 1255. If you remember last month when we talked about canonization, the formula for canonization isn't really set until the 1500s. So Clare could be canonized 2 years after her death. She's symbolized by a monstrance. When you see Clare, often she is connected to a monstrance, a pyx, which is a small golden container you've seen here at St. Ignatius, where the Eucharist is put into it for people who visit people in the hospital or sick. She's connected in many ways with the Eucharist. She's also symbolized by a lamp as a source of light. She is the patroness of those with eye diseases, goldsmiths, laundry workers, television workers, tailors, and she's an intercessor for good weather. And her feast is August the 11th. So here's a woman that often happens, at least in the history of religious life, in the Christian tradition, in the Catholic tradition, that there will be a man and a woman who are living very much the same ideals, and they very much become partners and create a family. In this case, it's the Franciscan family. The number of men and women who began coming to Francis and wanted to live what he was living because it seemed freer and easier and more joyful to live without all the encumbrances that society had placed upon them. They grew very rapidly in a very short time. Within his lifetime, there were probably 4,000 or 5,000. We're talking about a great deal of growth. Over time, humanity is humanity is humanity. Over time, there arose a desire to soften some of the rigors of the original rule that Francis wrote. Like, it's too hard to do this. We're always begging for things. Yes, in the beginning we went out and gathered stones, but now we're begging for food. We have to find places to live. All of these things. They wanted to rewrite the rule and soften some of the regulations, particularly those related to poverty. On several occasions, because of his authority, Francis was able to stop that movement. But eventually he realized that would be a losing game. So he chose not to have anything to do. It's not a statement of bitterness. He just chose not to have anything to do with the administration of the community. And so under his successor, a less strict rule was written and approved. Francis loved the community of his followers. He did. He says it frequently. But he did not agree with the directions the members were taking regarding their lifestyle. Bluntly, in his mind, the commitment to living the poor Christ, to living the way the poor Christ lived, was being seriously compromised. But he didn't criticize. He simply chose to live that himself. We know that Francis wanted to preach to all creatures, all over the world if he could have. He tried to make trips to the Holy Land, to Spain, to France, but none of those really materialized. Eventually, he did travel to Egypt, in fact, on foot. And he preached to the Muslim Sultan, who was quite impressed, but chose not to be converted, which was Francis' agenda, to convert him. But the Sultan gave him permission to visit the Holy Land and even provided an armed escort so that Francis would be safe in his travels. Another aspect, we know that Francis had a great love for Christmas, and you probably know this part of it. It was the celebration of the Incarnation. For Francis, this was the greatest of the feasts in the church. Very simply because without it, not even the Paschal mystery could have happened. Jesus had to be born. For him, it was the greatest of feasts. But he was also convinced people did not appreciate that. So in 1223, he builds this stable, and he organizes a living creche, much like we had here at St. Ignatius. The crib scene, so people could see the great love that Jesus had for them, that God had for them in sending Jesus. This had never been done before. Yes, we read the scriptures, but if you can imagine in a culture where a majority of people are not schooled, they do not read, to see the story become visual is extremely powerful. That's what Francis wanted to accomplish. To touch deeply into their faith. Do you understand how much God loves you? And that's just the Incarnation. We still have to get to all of the reality of the Eucharist and crucifixion and resurrection. But Francis chose to focus on the Incarnation. And the tradition of the Christmas crib has continued since that time. I know we think of, and we pass on to our children and to little ones in the family, the idea of Santa Claus. And we think of that as very old. Actually, it's not. Santa Claus was invented in the 1800s. Even though, yes, it goes back to St. Nicholas, who lived in the 4th century. Santa Claus is fairly new on the scene, actually. And he didn't always red with a beard. Most of the time he was in green, without a beard. But nevertheless. In 1224, 2 years before his death, as he was praying, Francis received the Stigmata. The Stigmata is a gift from God based on one's likeness to Jesus Christ. It consists of wounds, similar to those of Jesus crucified, in the hands and the feet and the side of the person. But it is a gift. It's not something one does or deserves. It is a gift that is given, and it's God's decision. But that gift and the experience of it expressed exactly what Francis wanted his life to be. Exactly what he wanted his life to be. A reflection of Jesus' example, especially in his suffering and death. Francis died on October 3rd, 1226, at 44 years old. He was canonized 2 years later, just as St. Clare was. He was canonized 2 years later in 1228. He had to be buried under armed guard. If you've ever, in Italy, when you go to Assisi and see the tomb of St. Francis, it's surrounded by steel bars. And it's because people came to the celebration of his death, to the funeral, if we want to call it that, with knives. They were hoping to take a piece of him with them. So he had to be buried under armed guard, so they made sure the whole body would make it into the tomb. It just shows you how popular he was. So 2 years later, he's canonized. And very much by public acclamation. Much like we saw with John Paul II, people wanted Francis canonized quickly, and he was. He was proclaimed a patron of Italy in 1939, the patron of ecology and the environment in 1980. So he's the patron of Italy, the environment, Catholic action, ecologists, merchants. He's symbolized in art by birds, by a deer, by fish, to cover the whole animal kingdom from air to land to sea. Birds, deer, fish. He's symbolized by a skull, the sense of the death of Christ, death to self. He's most certainly symbolized by the stigmata and the wolf. The wolf comes from another story where a wolf was terrorizing a small village, stealing food, and the people, of course, were afraid that eventually a child would be stolen. So they asked Francis if he could help, and Francis, as the story goes, had a conversation with the wolf. That if the people supply food to you, will you let them alone? The wolf agreed. So the people every day would put out food for the wolf. He came and got it, and that was it. So Francis came to be symbolized by a wolf. Francis of Assisi stands as a model of faithfully living the mission and the message of Jesus. Well, as I'd like to do with each of these mystics, I want to ask the question, what can we learn from him? We're talking about someone who lived almost 800 years ago. We see ourselves in the 20th and the 21st century as quite sophisticated. What can we possibly learn from someone who lived almost 800 years ago? Over many years, some authors and theologians have insisted that no one in Catholic history was as serious as St. Francis of Assisi about imitating Jesus Christ. Whatever our interpretation of that may be, it is accurate to say that he desired to be as literal as possible in following Jesus. That's why he doesn't think of the message, rebuild my church, as the church, meaning the body of Christ. That's what God was asking him to do. He understood it as rebuild the church, this building, and all of these buildings. Only later did he realize God was calling him to much more. It's an especially important point, his seriousness about imitating Christ, so that we don't see Francis simply as someone who lived poverty in an extreme way. Sometimes that's been done. And people will read the life of Francis and say, it's too much. His own followers did, and they were in his presence. It's too much. Francis embraced lady poverty, as he called it, not merely to be externally poor. He wanted to live the complete self-denial, the death to self that Jesus lived, to be completely dependent upon God. St. Paul tells us in Philippians, Jesus emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, emptied himself. That's what St. Francis wanted. That's what he strived to do. His focus in life was always Jesus, not poverty. He felt the compromise with poverty that was happening in the community was not because of poverty, because the more stuff we collected, it stood between, in his mind, between the members of the community and the imitation of Jesus Christ. It was too much stuff to plow through. No one had to be exactly like him, but he wanted them to understand whatever you do, whatever you have to do to reduce the distance between yourself and the Lord, do it. And if stuff gets in the way, do something about that stuff. It's a powerful message. And even his early followers had a hard time with that. His poverty was simply a means to live the life of the one whom he loved above all. St. Francis' foundational teaching is simply that Jesus must be the center of our life and nothing else. Everything flows from that center and everything moves toward that center. We have to live that example so our life reflects that in everything we are and in everything we do. Our everyday life must exemplify Jesus. That's not new to us. That's pure gospel. Francis just makes it very intense because he wants to be so literal about it. And anything that's in his way, he simply moves out of the way. It's through our life that we will incarnate Jesus, by our behavior, not by what we preach, but by our behaviors. According to Francis, in some situations, the example of our life might be the only way that Jesus is known. Think of that awesome responsibility. In some situations, the example of our life might be the only way that Jesus is known. Just because someone might not have read the gospel and may even know nothing about it, those are not reasons to say that the person cannot learn something of Jesus. They should be able to look at you and find the book of the gospel. Conversion doesn't happen because I tell someone, oh, here, go home and read the New Testament. I can assure you that's not going to work. Yes, the grace of God can intervene. I wouldn't deny that. But they need to see it. It's why when Mahatma Gandhi noticed how Christians would fight among themselves, Gandhi had read the New Testament. He knew the Hindu scriptures, the Muslim scriptures. He knew all of the scriptures and the Christian scriptures. And his famous line is, I admire the Christ. I admire the Christ, but not the Christians. Because he saw the gap. That's what Francis is struggling with, the gap. That people need to see the book of the gospel, the book of the gospel. I need to be the pages that the person turns. That's why Francis is noted to have said, do all you can to preach the gospel. And if necessary, use words. Isn't that interesting? We're a very verbal culture. His was a very verbal culture, and he's very fluent because he's so well educated. But here he's saying, no, preach the gospel, and if you need to use words, for him, the first preacher was our actions. And I'm sure, I don't want you to sit there and criticize anyone, but surely you've had the experience somewhere in life of feeling, as you're listening to a person, your actions are speaking so loud, I can't hear what you're saying. So what you're saying, I can't count, because you're behaving very differently than what you're saying. That's what Francis touches. Jesus served God, we know that, by coming for us, by becoming one of us for our salvation. For Francis, his relationship with God, people, animals, all of creation, was essentially a relationship of service. He was to be at the service of all of God's creatures and creation. The true servant can give everything because the true servant understands that everything is a gift. That's the only way that's going to work. I give because I have received. That's the foundation upon which Francis built his sense of poverty and humility and simplicity, on nothing else. It was a way of giving. I give because I have received. The danger is, in his mind, is when we receive and then become safety deposit boxes. We hold on to it. And the gift, God does not take back gifts. God's gifts are irrevocable, like God's love. But gifts can rust. They can wear out. They cannot be used. And eventually we might even forget we have them. Francis lived in creation as if he was in a personal relationship with every aspect of it. His language reflects that everything is either a brother or a sister to him. Now, of course, I understand that's part of the reality of Italian grammar. Much like other Romance languages, nouns are either masculine or feminine. But nevertheless, that type of language for him was not an idealism. It was not a romanticism. It was rooted in the genuine belief that creation is a reflection of God. So one's relationship with creation reflected one's relationship with God. That sounds wonderful. It's the other side of it that's unsettling, because abuse of creation is abuse of God. It's interesting to note that Francis believed this and articulated this centuries before the church developed a theology of creation, a theology of the environment. Centuries before. He simply saw it in terms of relationship, not in terms of some high theology. And the church's teaching on that is quite sound and quite good. Francis simply looked and said, I am in this, much like a fish is in the ocean. And what I do has a ripple effect, for good or for not good. Creation deserves care and respect from his perspective, not because it sustains our life, that's a given, but because it reflects God's love and concern for us. It's interesting, if I can add just one contemporary thing that I hope we reflect upon. I know not many of us could give a grocery list of good things that have come from the pandemic. But especially at the beginning of the pandemic, when people really weren't moving around at all. I remember wanting to take a picture of I-35 because there weren't many cars on it. I said, this is a miracle. This is unbelievable. What has been the effect of that? And we know this. Part of the ozone layer healed, and in some countries, pollution dropped dramatically. Dramatically. That should teach us. There were places in India where people said in their whole life they had never seen the sky blue. It was always sort of brownish blue because of pollution. I think from Francis' perspective, that's a challenge to us. One day, God willing, the pandemic will be over. Then do we simply go back to normal? And I know that's the feeling we all want. But our normal can have an impact on creation. Francis saw himself very much within the whole of creation. And he understood, and these are the days before pollution like we think of it. He understood what he did would have an impact. That's why he could care for the animals and wanting to be in relationship with them. Francis gave whatever he received because he understood that everything was a gift. Evidently, that was part of his DNA, even in his, let's call it, playboy years. And I don't mean it as that usual image. In those years when he was the life of the party, I said he treated his friends well. Yes, he had wealth and he could use it, but it was basically from his father. He had received it. Well, now, later in life, he understands everything is a gift from God. He believed that wars happen. Why do wars happen? Because people take their possessions and hold on to them as if they're self-generated. This is mine, by my creation. No, it's not. You got it from somewhere. Even life is not ours. You had parents. Everything is a gift to us. St. Francis, I think, lived well and understood the question that St. Paul asks in his letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians. Did not God give you everything you have? Well, then how can you boast as if what you have were not a gift? It's a great Franciscan question to pray over. Did not God give you everything you have? Well, then how can you boast as if what you have were not a gift? For Francis, poverty was a natural expression of responding to that. To being in a relationship with a God who loves us lavishly and gives us extravagantly. With the gifts that we have, we're called to be lavish and to be extravagant in our relationship with others. That doesn't mean we compromise our own well-being or the well-being of our family. It means that I give what I can and be generous in giving it. We learn from Francis of Assisi that everything must be revalued in light of relationship with Jesus. It's not that people or creation don't have value. That would be nonsense. They do have value. And they have eminent value because they're reflections of a loving God. Poverty, simplicity, humility facilitate revaluing. This is valuable to me. But if it stands in my way, in my relationship with the Lord, I have to revalue this. Maybe it needs to be behind me, not in front of me. Those are hard questions because we have to look at our own life. It can create a war within us. Francis was talking about wars between nations because everyone's saying, no, this is my property. No, this is my property, and I'll beat you up if you don't give me my property. That war can happen within us too, when things get in the way between myself and my relationship with the Lord. There's nothing romantic or theoretical about the stories we hear of Francis, his gentleness with animals. We can even say his relationship with them. All of creation for him is one. The church teaches that. And we bear responsibility to respect it because we do have an influence on it. And our influence, our activity, because it was reduced in the midst of the pandemic, it taught us things can heal. The earth can heal. All of creation is in relationship with all the rest of creation. Poverty was Francis' way. We have to decide our way. Poverty was Francis' way of assuring that his relationship with God would never be reduced in priority. It would always maintain priority. Francis never wanted to mistake creation or the creature for the creator. He never wanted to mistake the gift for the giver, because that can happen. So much can get between me and God that I no longer see the giver, and then I can't answer St. Paul's question anymore. What do you have that's not a gift? And if there is something blocking my way toward a relationship with God, I see what I can do to move it out of the way. Creation is good. That's the readings we're beginning now in Genesis. God looked at everything that was created and called it good. Francis never questioned that. His question was, is sometime priority given to creatures, to created things, to my own possessions, to my own accomplishments, that I forget the giver? That the gift takes priority over the giver. And it's possible to forget God. Just forget God. We live in a society, that's highly developed, materialistic, consumeristic, commercialism, expanding technology. None of that is evil. None of it. Even from a Franciscan perspective, none of it is evil. Material goods are necessary, that, for the preservation of life, for the preservation of your livelihoods, care for your family, supporting your family. And we also know material goods that we consider luxuries today, they won't be luxuries tomorrow. They'll be necessities. There was a time the automobile, we know, was a luxury. One thing or another was a luxury. Today, we take it for granted. Luxuries today will be necessities tomorrow as humanity. The challenge for us from St. Francis is always to maintain the perspective of faith in relationship to all of that. Where do I find my identity? I think that's the ultimate Franciscan question. Where do I find my identity? On what do I base my value as a person? If we root our identity in what we have accomplished, then I think we're building on very shaky ground. Jesus says it quite bluntly. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where is my heart? Where is my heart? I may not want to admit it, that's what my treasure is. I can use words like, I'm really detached from it. Really? Only you and God are going to know that. No one has the right to judge that, but where is my heart? Jesus is right. Where my treasure is, there my heart will be. And if my treasure is in that long list of accomplishments I have, of possessions I have, and I'm not judging, but we know people do that. That's their treasure. That's where their heart is. But what happens when either through disaster or something else that's taken away and it disappears? A natural disaster, a flood, a hurricane, a fire. People can be crushed. Maybe because they've never touched the beauty that's within. They've never seen that they themselves are a gift of God. Maybe it's why we're born naked and we have nothing but us. And maybe in a sense, that's how we're buried. St. Francis St. Francis makes, it's on your handout, makes this wonderful statement. Remember that when you leave this earth, you can take with you nothing you have received, only what you have given. A full heart, enriched by honest service, love, sacrifice, and courage. I can't take it with me, as the statement says. I can only take what I have given, because that's what God will ask us about. How well did you love? I don't believe God will ask us, well, tell me about all your accomplishments. Tell me about all your wonderful achievements. Not that those aren't important, but I don't think that's what God will ask. There's only one commandment: love one another. How well did you love? If our treasure and our heart are rooted in things that are outside who we are by nature, when they disappear, in a certain sense, so can we. Think of people who are no longer living. Maybe members of your family, maybe people you look up to, but you know they had an influence in your life. You know they had, maybe a teacher, could be a pastor. You know they had an influence in your life. Ask yourself and reflect on why. What is it about them that touched me? What is it about them that I still carry with me? And you may find it's not an accomplishment of theirs. It's something much deeper. It's not just something they gave you in a material sense. It's something much deeper. Francis is not calling everyone to live poverty as he lived it. He never does that. But his life and teaching do call us to depend on God for all things in everything. And that remains a constant challenge for our life. And the truth is, ultimately, it's the work of a lifetime. I want to close with, and then see if you have any questions, just with a prayer that we know from St. Francis well enough. I think it sums up a great deal about his life. If you have the handout, I would ask we pray it together. It's on the very last page under the image. If you pray it with me, we'll pray together. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. That prayer has long been associated with St. Francis, and notice the word poverty doesn't even appear in it. He's talking about a whole other set of values. Anyway, thank you so much, and thank all of those who were watching this evening. If you have any questions or any other comments you want to make, I would only ask for that you remove your mask so we can hear clearly if you have a question. Or if a question comes from those in the internet.
So if you have a question online, just type it into the Facebook comment area, or on the website, there's a form underneath wherever you're watching this. Or if you're here in person, you can just stand up and say your question. And then I'll repeat it for the people online. So the question is, did he ever reconcile with his parents?
No, he never did. Actually, I'm not so sure in the story. It's not completely clear, but I don't think he ever returned to his home again. And we can look at that and say how sad. It's just that I think given the world of the time, I mean, Francis has to deal with himself now that he's in heaven. But that would have just not been comprehensible to people in the wealthy echelons of society. It would have just not been comprehensible. From their perspective, it would have been a lack of gratitude. A lack of gratitude of all we've given you, your education, life itself, the wealth that you had. He never really did, because his life came and he dies fairly young. I don't know when his parents died. That's not really so clear in the record, because he never talks about that. It's possible he may have died before his father or mother. Probably before his mother, because women tended to live longer, because they were home, and so food was better, all of those things. And men were traveling and exposed to all kind of other things. So I found no indication that he had reconciled with them. And it's interesting, in the Middle Ages, sometimes when people, we don't think of that so much today, at least not in Holy Cross, but when people entered religious communities, for them it was a real break. And they may have even gone elsewhere. Francis really, other than the trip to the Holy Land, he doesn't really go to Egypt and then the Holy Land. He doesn't really go outside of Italy very much, even though his followers were scattered all over the place very quickly, even in other countries. So that's a great question. Thank you. Thank you. I don't recommend that you take that approach. It's just, that's the way grace unfolded in his own life, and he had to deal with that.
We did get a question online. Can you comment on the perspective of church history about the significance of a pope selecting Francis as his name? What does that possibly tell us about Pope Francis?
Ask the first part again.
So from the perspective of church history, perhaps, what's the significance of Pope Francis selecting Francis?
Oh, great question. As I understand the story, and if someone knows otherwise, please let me know. As I understand the story, during the conclave of the election of Pope Francis, as it became obvious, I can imagine that's a real crisis in your life. You're sitting there among the other cardinals, and as the election is taking place, meaning everyone votes by a secret ballot, it's open and the name is read, and you're hearing your name again and again and again, and you're saying, what is going on here? I don't know if I want this job. And as it became clear that more than likely, if not on this ballot, but the next ballot, whichever number it was, he would more than likely be elected, one of his friends turned to him and said, "Remember the poor." Like saying, if you become Pope, don't forget the poor, which Francis has done. My understanding is, and maybe he had already been thinking and praying about it, I suppose cardinals do, if you have even a sense that you might be elected. Of course, when Pope Benedict was elected Pope, the other name, not for Benedict, the other cardinal was precisely Bergoglio, was Francis. So maybe he had a sense after Pope Benedict resigned, so to speak. Anyway, that's my thinking. Because he comes up with, he's Francis the First. We really hadn't had a Francis before. And even though he's a Jesuit, there were many great Jesuit saints. He could have chosen Francis Xavier, the great missionary. But he chooses Francis because Francis is so associated with the poor and care of creation and the very things Pope Francis has been talking about and writing about. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it.
We did get another one online. Can you speak further about Francis's stigmata? Was it similar to Padre Pio's?
Yes. In general, the stigmata is identical from person to person. It's literally a wound from front to back, on both hands, both feet, and a wound in the side. And Francis, and it's a pure gift. It's not something, you say, I'm going to pray for this. I don't know that Francis was expecting that. His desire, and it was true of Padre Pio also, was this passionate desire to live as Jesus lived. And if that includes the crucifixion, so be it. And so Francis, and as I think Padre Pio did, and they're very humble about it. Very humble about it. Because Padre Pio is more contemporary. I don't know Francis' experience in this regard, but doctors wanted to examine the stigmata. And at one point, he needed an appendectomy. And Padre Pio said, an appendectomy requires anesthesia. If they put me under anesthesia, they're going to inspect this. And that's not what this is about. This isn't about, oh, look at me. This is about Jesus. So he chose to have the appendectomy without anesthesia because he did not want to fall asleep and then have the doctors unwrap his hands and his feet, even though he had to mostly be undressed for the surgery, obviously. It shows you that, and there's for him, that was a sense of humility. This is not something I'm going to show off. He wanted to keep that very private. So usually when you see photos of him, yes, it's wrapped in bandage, but then he's like wearing black gloves or something, and trying to carry on as well as he could. So it has to be understood that it's a gift. Yes, an extraordinary gift. But it's a gift and it's God's decision. There have been men and women throughout history of Catholicism, of Christianity, who have received the stigmata. Anyway, thank you for that question also, because it's one of those rare things we don't usually think of. Yes?
I just had a question about sort of Francis' conversion. You sort of talked about two ways. One is we have reflection time, when he was taken prisoner and he was convalescing. But then there's this sort of light switch story, the leper.
Yes.
Do you sense that it's a light switch going off in Francis, or is it an evolution of a building towards this?
That's a great question. Thank you.
So the question is about Francis's conversion, if it was more of a light switch moment or sort of a thing that just kind of snowballed, I guess.
Right. Thank you. I think it's a little bit of both. The leper thing, I don't even think he understood. This would have been completely repulsive to him, to embrace this person who was an outcast of society, who wasn't valued, excuse me for saying it, but was just a little higher than animals, and animals could have been valued more. I think the rebuilding of the church, all right, from collecting stones to his awareness that the Lord is talking about the church as a whole, I think that dawned on him slowly. Because he continues building churches, literally, putting bricks together. But as the community goes to Rome, to ask for the approval of their rule, it's the Pope himself, Innocent III, who says, I had a dream about you, and the church was falling down, and you were underneath it holding it. And he had a dream of literally a church, but it meant the church falling down, and Francis, so he approves the rule. And then I think Francis realized, maybe it was growing all along, I'm not denying that, but that sort of gave the real stamp for him that this is bigger than I realize. It's not about just building these individual churches in Italy, or at least in his area of Italy, that it collapsed. But the leper thing, he really doesn't explain. I think it maybe even shocked him. Maybe it's that part of the responsibility to love all of creation, even those who are most outcast. And you could not get further apart than a leper and someone from the absolute wealth of society who would never, even be seen dirty or anything like that. So that's a great question, his conversion. Because it's not as clear as, say, St. Paul's, boom, it's there. Or St. Augustine even, or others who have had these dramatic, almost lightning strikes. Francis, I think, as smart as he was, as well educated as he was, he seemed to had to learn that, oh, this is what I'm called to do. And probably his own brothers and sisters, as the community grew of the Franciscans and the Poor Clares, they gave him other ideas also. He seems to be one who is quite open to many things unless it involved interfering in any way what was involved in living the poor Christ, that he could not tolerate. Even the story goes when they were asking him to at least read the rule as they rewrote it. His eyes blurred. He literally could not read it. He could read, but he couldn't see the words. So it was a way of, the Lord was not permitting him even to read that there would be these compromises in what he believed. So thank you. Thank you for that. Yes.
So the question is about the Franciscan order and the charism and how it exists to this day.
Today there are basically, I don't know the perfect history of all the divisions. Today there are, at least among the men, there are three different orders. The conventual, the originals, who are the Order of the Friars Minor that he founded, and then the conventuals, and the, who's the group I'm forgetting? Yes, the Capuchins. Again, partly because of disagreements, partly of nuances in ministry, the community divided. It's much like today we have three sisters community of Holy Cross sisters. It's not that they don't like one another, it's just history's moved in different directions. I think the Franciscans today, I know several Franciscans and I'm good friends with several. They struggle today with just what we've talked about. They continue, and to me that's the grace, that they're willing to continue to struggle. How can I firmly preach the importance of the Incarnation? How can I firmly preach that we are, in fact, all of creation is one? Franciscans have done wonderful work in theology of creation and seeing this interconnectedness, as they might say. And yet they will struggle with it because we know everyone struggles with it. They still will struggle with, Francis continues after 800 years to be extraordinarily attractive. But there will be those people that say, how did he do that? Well, it was a grace. Yes, it was a conversion, but it was a grace also. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to go throw away everything I have tomorrow. I don't advise that at all. Your family might get quite angry at that because it's not the response to grace. For Francis, it worked. It didn't work for everyone who immediately followed him, and even throughout history. I don't know, I will be honest, I don't know precisely how they might articulate what they would call their charism. But I'm sure it's related at least to preaching the unity of creation, and because we see so many places where that's not true. I mean, we have to be honest about our own footprint on creation, for better, for worse. The very fact that, because we're not moving around, we hear that the ozone layer is healing somewhat and pollution is down. That should, hopefully it'll teach us something we can think about when we can one day, who knows, look back at the pandemic and think of it as history. So that's a great question. But I think Franciscans today, the ones that I know, they struggle with that. They will still struggle with that. And that's a good thing. I think for a religious community not to struggle with what a founder said, we do that in Holy Cross. It's a tragedy. I want to be unsettled by what the founder said and say, I still have yet more work to do in that regard. So thank you. Thank you. Is there a question back there?
So the question is, after Francis realized the call was greater than merely rebuilding the physical church, did he actually continue to do that work of rebuilding the physical churches, right? Is that?
Not so much. Once he decided, I may have forgotten to mention it, once he moved out of the administration of the community, he did continue to do that to a certain degree. However, the Pope asked him to do other things also, to preach, to work on the conversion of people. But when he moved out of the administration of the community, because he felt inconsistencies were happening, Francis lived the rest of his life as a hermit. He literally went to live in a cave. Again, that's being completely stripped of everything. He didn't have possessions. And I'm not criticizing this. It's not my place. But the Franciscans were building houses. And for his mind, that's a possession that could get in the way of a relationship with God. And it made them less mobile. Because if I have this house, I have to care for it. So Francis tended to live as a hermit. There were those who remained very, very close to him, especially the women, who wanted to be fiercely faithful to his original vision of living simply, of living poorly. So no, he didn't continue that work anymore. I think he did realize before he ended his life as a hermit, he realized that it was the bigger church that now he was being called to be involved in. So thank you. Let me look at our time. Do we wanna...
No other questions?
No. Thank you all so much. Come next month if you can. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Joel, again for introducing or reintroducing us to this this humble man who just sought to follow Christ. And I hope you can join us next month on March 8th. We're going to learn about St. Catherine of Siena. So another mystic who I'm sure has a fascinating story. So thank you all again for coming, and drive safe on your way back home.